In the autumn of 1968, a Green Beret named Sergeant First Class Ray Doyle stood in a briefing tent in South Vietnam. He was told officially that he was not going where he was about to go. The mission was straightforward in the way that the worst missions always are. A team of 12 men was going to cross a border. 2 other Americans went with him, plus a handful of Montagnard and Nung tribesmen, fierce, loyal fighters recruited from the highlands. According to every public statement his government had ever made, American soldiers did not cross this border. They were going into Laos anyway, along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to find out what was moving on it. Their job was to make it as dangerous as possible for the men moving it. Doyle asked as a formality what would happen if the team was compromised and could not be extracted. The answer he received was the coldest sentence any soldier can be told before a mission. There would be no record that they had ever been there at all. He would carry no dog tags with his own name on them into that country. His rifle would have no American markings, made in a foreign country, untraceable. His uniform would be unmarked, the kind worn by 12 different armies. If his body was found, no one could prove which government had sent him. He was going to a place his own country would deny. He would wear gear designed to make sure that denial could never be disproven. And the mission would not appear in any record for years if it ever appeared at all. Doyle understood what this meant, and it is worth sitting with because it is stranger and colder than simple danger. Every other soldier in that war belonged to a story his country was willing to tell. However desperate his situation, if he died, there would be an official account, a location, a unit, a citation. Doyle was about to disappear into a country his government insisted he was not in. He would be doing things his government would not admit to ordering. If it went wrong, there might be no story at all, only silence. And a family at home told something that was not quite the truth for years because the truth was classified. Doyle could not know, standing in that tent, that he would survive the mission and many others like it. He would live to see the day, decades later, when the files were finally opened and the world learned what men like him had actually done. He knew only that he was about to walk into the most dangerous country in the world with 9 other men, invisible. He went on behalf of a government that would swear, if asked, that he was not there. That is the story of the deadliest, quietest, and least known American war effort of the entire conflict. Now let me show you what it actually took to fight a war that officially did not exist. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand what Doyle was walking into, you first have to understand the strange, secret organization that sent him, one of the most classified American military units of the entire 20th century. To understand the mission Doyle was about to run, you have to understand the organization behind it, because it was unlike almost anything else in the American military, and its strangeness was the whole point. It was called MACV-SOG, the Studies and Observations Group, a name chosen precisely because it sounded boring, a name that would draw no attention on a document that would draw no questions, attached to a unit that did some of the most dangerous work of the entire war. Think about the choice of that name for a moment, because it tells you everything about how this organization was meant to function. Studies and Observations Group sounds like a committee. It sounds like men in an office reading reports. Whoever chose it chose well, because a name like that draws no second glance on a budget line or a briefing schedule. Nobody asks a follow-up question about a studies group. That was the whole design. The unit's own name was its first layer of camouflage, built before a single man had ever crossed a border. It was activated in the mid-1960s, reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff rather than through the normal chain of command in Vietnam. That meant its missions were authorized at the highest level and shielded from ordinary oversight. It drew its men from across the American military, Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Air Force Commandos, Marine reconnaissance. Every single one of them was a volunteer, because you could not order a man into the kind of work SOG did. You could only ask and hope enough of them said yes. Its purpose was to fight the part of the war that the front page never saw. While the conventional American Army fought inside South Vietnam, the enemy's supply lines ran outside it. They ran down through neighboring countries that were, on paper, neutral, countries the United States had publicly promised not to violate. The most famous of these routes was a network of trails and roads that supplied the war from the north. It ran for hundreds of miles through jungle, then around through another country to the west. It carried the men and weapons and rice that kept the war in the south alive. Everyone knew it existed. Almost no one outside a small circle knew how thoroughly the Americans were fighting on it, because officially, they were not fighting there at all. That was SOG's job. Small teams did the work, often just 2 or 3 Americans leading a handful of indigenous fighters. These were men recruited from hill tribes and minority groups who had their own reasons to fight and who fought superbly. They would cross the border on foot. Deep into territory the United States insisted it had never entered. They watched the trail, they counted the trucks, they planted mines, and called in airstrikes on convoys. They snatched prisoners for interrogation. They did everything in their power to make the enemy's supply line as costly and unreliable as they could, all while operating under the fiction that they had never left South Vietnam at all. To make that fiction survive contact with reality, everything about these teams was designed to be deniable. They did not carry standard American equipment. They carried foreign-made rifles, purchased or acquired specifically because they left no trail back to an American arsenal. Hold that detail in your hand for a second because it is a strange one. An American soldier trained on American weapons in an American unit carrying a rifle built somewhere else entirely, chosen not because it was better, but because it could not be traced. Every serial number, every stamp, every design cue on that weapon was a deliberate erasure of the man holding it. If it was found beside his body, it would tell an investigator nothing true. It would say, this could be anyone. That was the point. The weapon in his hands was built to lie about him. Their uniforms bore no insignia, no name tapes, nothing that could identify a nationality, let alone a unit. If a team was compromised and a body was recovered by the other side, there would be nothing on it to prove which government had sent it. There would be nothing to admit that a foreign army was operating on that soil at all. The soldier's own equipment was built, item by item, to make sure his country could keep lying about where he was. This was the organization Doyle belonged to, and it is worth pausing on what an extraordinary thing it was to ask of a soldier. Every other man in that war fought for a country that would, at minimum, admit he existed and tell his story if he died. SOG asked its men to fight without even that. It asked them to accept that the government sending them into the most dangerous ground in the war would, if things went wrong, deny it had sent them at all. To understand what a mission actually looked like, you have to understand something else first. The astonishing mismatch between the size of these teams and the size of what they were up against. It is the key to everything that made this work so dangerous and so effective. A recon team going across the border typically numbered somewhere around a dozen men. Often it included fewer Americans than that, frequently just 2 or 3 leading a larger group of Montagnard, Nung, or other indigenous soldiers. These men knew the terrain, and they fought with a skill and loyalty that the Americans who served alongside them came to respect enormously. 12 men walking into a country crawling with tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. The enemy's entire purpose in that region was to protect the very supply line the team had come to disrupt. There was no reinforcement waiting nearby. There was no friendly territory to retreat into. There was only the team, its radio, and whatever aircraft could be summoned from far away if everything went wrong. Picture the insertion itself, because it is the moment everything narrowed to a single point. Helicopters carried the team low over unbroken jungle, looking for a clearing small enough to be unremarkable and big enough to land in. They did not want a good landing zone. A good landing zone was one the enemy already knew about. So they took whatever ugly, cramped gap in the canopy the map and the pilot's eye could find. They went down fast. The 12 men were out and moving into the tree line within seconds because the helicopters lingering on the ground were the loudest possible announcement that something had just happened. Then the aircraft climbed away and the noise faded and the team was alone. Truly alone. No friendly unit within any reasonable marching distance. No safe direction. Just jungle, and the trail somewhere ahead of them, and however many thousand enemy soldiers moved through that country, believing it was theirs alone. The team itself is worth picturing too, because it was rarely built the way people imagine. 2 Americans, sometimes 3, and the rest montagnard or Nung. These were men who often knew this jungle the way the Americans knew a home street. They could read a broken branch or a footprint the way Doyle read a map. The Americans who served beside them described their courage again and again in the most admiring terms available. This was not a team of Americans with local guides. It was a genuinely mixed unit, and the men leaned on each other completely because there was no one else to lean on. The trail itself was not a single road. It was an entire logistics system spread across hundreds of miles. It had truck parks, way stations, anti-aircraft positions, and thousands of soldiers whose job was to keep it running. Part of that job was hunting down exactly the kind of small reconnaissance team that Doyle was leading. The enemy took these teams extremely seriously. It dedicated real forces to finding and destroying them, trackers, dedicated reaction units, whole networks built around one specific problem. That problem was small American-led teams appearing out of nowhere in territory the enemy considered safe and sovereign. A 12-man team was not slipping past a careless enemy. It was operating inside the beating heart of a hostile, alert, and heavily defended logistics network. Every single mission carried the real possibility of running into a force many times its size. Once inserted, the team moved with the same silent discipline we have talked about in other stories. The stakes were raised even further here because there was no friendly unit to call for help if things went wrong. There were only aircraft that might be many minutes or longer away over hostile ground the whole distance. The team's job was to observe and to survive being observed. It counted trucks and troops. It marked locations for airstrikes. Sometimes it laid mines on the trail itself or planted sabotaged ordnance among captured supplies. And through all of it, it tried to remain what it needed to remain above everything else. Unseen. For a team this size, this deep, this far from help, being seen was very often the beginning of the end. And when a team was compromised, when the enemy found them, which happened often because the enemy was searching hard and the terrain gave away almost as much as it hid, what followed was some of the most desperate combat of the entire war. 12 men cut off, deep in hostile territory, fighting a much larger force, running for a landing zone that might not yet exist, calling for extraction on a radio that might or might not reach anyone in time. These fights were brutal, close, and often decided within minutes. A compromised team that could not break contact and reach an extraction point quickly would simply be overwhelmed. The men who did this work lived with the knowledge that every mission carried a real chance of ending exactly that way. Picture it happening, because the shape of it repeated itself again and again across the years of the program. A team is moving along a ridge, careful, quiet, and somewhere ahead, a tracker finds their trail and does not use it. Contact comes suddenly, a burst of fire from a direction no one expected. Because the enemy had time to set the terms, the team returns fire and starts falling back toward whatever clearing the map showed as a possible landing zone, fighting the whole way because stopping is death and running blind is death, and the only path through is fighting while moving. The radio operator is shouting coordinates into a handset, praying something is close enough to hear him, and somewhere, many miles distant, aircraft turn and start flying as fast as they can toward a fight they may not reach in time. Those last minutes, before help arrived or did not, were some of the purest terror in the entire war, compressed into a space the size of a football field. And there was a second version of that terror, playing out at the same moment, far away. Back at the command post, men sat by radios, listening to a fight they could not see and could not shape, waiting for coordinates, waiting for a voice to come back on the net. Silence on that radio was its own kind of agony. Every minute, without a transmission, was a minute in which 12 men might already be gone. And there was nothing anyone at that post could do but keep the aircraft moving and hope the next call, if it came, would be in time. 12 men, sometimes fewer by the time it mattered, holding a perimeter against a much larger force, counting rounds, watching the sky for the first sign of rescue. Some of these fights ended with the team pulled out under fire, wounded, and shaking seconds from being overrun. Some did not end that way at all. If you want to understand what this work actually cost, you do not need adjectives. You need the numbers, because they say more plainly than any description could exactly what it meant to volunteer for this. The casualty rate in these reconnaissance units across the years of the program has been described by the men who lived it and by the historians who later studied it as approaching, and in some units, reaching 100%. Read that carefully, because it does not mean everyone died. It means that by the end of a man's time in this work, he had overwhelmingly either been wounded, often more than once, or killed. Survival without being hit at all was the exception, not the rule. Men went back out on mission after mission carrying wounds from the last one. The work needed doing, and there were never enough volunteers to rotate the ones who had already bled. Picture what that actually looked like in a team room, waiting for the next mission. A sergeant with a scar from a round that had gone through his shoulder 2 missions ago, still stiff, still healing, checking his gear anyway. A radio man with shrapnel still working its way out of his leg, walking the line to make sure it would hold his weight in the jungle. These were not men pretending to be fine. They were men who understood there was no replacement standing behind them, and that the team going out tomorrow needed every experienced hand it could get, healed or not. Nobody praised them for it particularly. It was simply what the job required, and they had all agreed by volunteering to require it of themselves. Think about what it means to volunteer for a job with those odds, and to keep volunteering for it, mission after mission, year after year. These were not men who did not understand the danger. The casualty rate was not a secret within the community. Everyone in it knew exactly what the numbers looked like because they watched them happen to the men beside them, and they went anyway. The work mattered. The team beside them was going. A soldier does not let his team go into that country without him. The results these small teams achieved, measured against their size, are almost as staggering as the cost. In the operations along these cross-border trails, Teams that numbered in the dozens accounted for enemy casualties through direct action and the airstrikes they called in that ran into the thousands over the life of the program. Kill ratios in the documented actions ran as high as 6, 8, even 11 enemy casualties for every American lost. No conventional unit of comparable size came close to that ratio. No conventional unit was doing this specific job, finding the enemy at his most vulnerable, in the place he thought was safest, and calling down devastating firepower on him before vanishing back across a border that officially did not separate two active war zones at all. Think about why that ratio was even possible. Because it is not really about marksmanship. A conventional unit fought the enemy where the enemy chose to stand and fight, often dug in, often prepared, often with the advantage of ground. The small teams did something different. They found the enemy moving, exposed, strung out along a trail in the open, confident that this deep inside his own territory, nothing could touch him. That confidence was the target as much as the trucks were. A soldier who believes he is safe does not take cover. He does not disperse. He walks in the open, in daylight, on a road he has used 100 times without incident. The team's whole advantage was arriving in the one place the enemy had stopped expecting a fight, and making him pay the price of that comfort before he even understood what was happening. And the price paid to achieve it was extraordinary by any standard. This small community of volunteers numbered only in the hundreds at any given time. Across the life of the program, it suffered losses that would have been considered catastrophic in a unit of any size. Decades after the war ended, dozens of these men were still listed among the missing, men who had crossed a border their country would not admit existed as a battlefield, and who had never come back. In many cases, their fate has never been fully resolved even now. The program produced 12 Medal of Honor recipients, the most of any unit in the entire war relative to its size. That tells you plainly what kind of combat these small teams were enduring over and over, deep inside territory where officially there was no war being fought by Americans at all. Here is the part of the story that sets it apart from almost everything else in that war, and it is not the danger, terrible as the danger was. It is the specific cold weight of knowing that if the mission went wrong, you might not just die. You might disappear officially into a silence your own country had built in advance. Consider what this meant in practice. If Doyle's team was compromised beyond recovery, deep in that denied country, there was a real possibility that no rescue would come. Not because anyone stopped trying. A large-scale rescue effort would itself expose the very cross-border operations the government was denying. Every mission carried this awful, unstated ceiling on how far the response could go before it became its own admission of guilt. The men going in understood this bargain, even if it was never spoken aloud in those exact terms. We send you because the mission matters, and if it goes wrong, the same secrecy that let us send you may limit what we can do to bring you back. And consider what this meant for the families waiting at home, because this is where the cost lands hardest, and it deserves to be said plainly. If a man from a conventional unit died in South Vietnam, his family received eventually an accounting, a place, a unit, a story, however incomplete, that could be told and grieved. For men lost on these cross-border missions, the true story was often classified for years, sometimes for decades. Families were told, in many cases, only that a son or husband was missing in Vietnam. It was often a country he might never have set foot in on the day he was lost because he had been in a neighboring country the government would not name. They grieved without the truth. Some of them did not learn the real story of where their loved one had died until the records were finally declassified long after the war ended, long after their own capacity to fully feel the answer had been worn down by decades of not knowing. Picture the knock on the door in this version of the story, because it is not the same knock as the one other families received. A man in uniform arrives. He tells the family their son is missing in Vietnam. That much is true, in the narrowest sense, and it is also a kind of lie because the son was not in Vietnam when he was lost. He was in a country 3 hours' walk from a border the government would not name, on a mission the government would not describe, and the man delivering the news may not even be allowed to know the details himself. He offers what comfort he can, within the limits of what he is permitted to say, and then he leaves, and the family is left with a grief that has no proper shape, because the true shape of it is locked in a file somewhere, waiting for a clearance that has not yet been granted. That family lives the rest of their lives inside that gap. They mark an anniversary for a loss they cannot fully describe. They tell relatives a version of the story that is not quite complete, because it is the only version they have. And some of them, years or decades later, open a newspaper or a declassified file and read for the first time where their son actually died, and how and why a truth that arrives too late to change anything, and yet somehow still matters enormously because knowing, even decades late, is still better than the gap it replaces. This is the specific, quiet horror that separates the story from an ordinary tale of wartime danger. It is not only that Doyle and men like him risked their lives in the most hostile ground of the entire war. It is that they risked disappearing into an official silence their own country had constructed on purpose, as a condition of the mission. That silence could, in the worst case, outlast their own lives by decades, and it fell not on them, but on the people who loved them, who would spend years not knowing the truth their government had classified away. And here is what should be said clearly, because it is the thing that makes these men remarkable rather than merely unfortunate. They knew this, not vaguely, specifically. They understood, standing in the briefing tent, exactly what they were agreeing to. The danger, the deniability, the silence that might follow if it went wrong. They understood the price their own families might pay in confusion and grief for a truth withheld by classification. And they went anyway, mission after mission. Someone had to disrupt that trail. The team beside them needed a leader. The volunteers who did this work were, almost without exception, precisely the kind of men who could not walk away from a job that needed doing simply because the job had decided, on top of everything else, to erase them. It would be easy to end the story as a simple tale of heroism triumphing against impossible odds. The heroism was entirely real, but an honest telling has to reckon with the full shape of what these missions achieved and what they did not achieve, because both are true and both matter. The enemy came to fear these small teams with real and specific intensity, and that fear is well documented. A trail that felt safe deep inside what the enemy considered secure territory was not safe at all. A dozen men might already be watching it, marking every truck for a strike that could fall from a clear sky with no warning. The enemy dedicated significant forces specifically to hunting these teams, trackers, standing reaction forces, entire local security networks. They were built around one singular threat. Small, deniable, deadly reconnaissance elements appearing where they were never supposed to be able to reach. Pound for pound, man for man, these teams may have been among the most effective forces fielded by either side in the entire war. And yet the honest reckoning must include this. For all the trucks destroyed, all the intelligence gathered, all the friction added to the enemy's supply effort, the trail itself was never closed. the enemy adapted, rerouted, and rebuilt. It kept moving men and material south throughout the war, because the effort behind that supply line was a matter of national survival for the other side. No force of this size, however brilliant and however brave, could sever an artery that an entire nation was determined to keep open. These teams made every mile of that trail more expensive, more dangerous, and less reliable for the enemy. They did not and could not stop it. This is not a diminishment of what these men did. It is the same honest reckoning this whole channel has tried to bring to every story on every side of that long war. Individual skill and courage, however extraordinary, operates within limits set by the scale of the conflict around it. A dozen men crossing a border in the dark, doing brilliant and terrifying work at a cost that approached total, changed the price of that war for the enemy without changing its outcome. Both of those facts are true, and holding them together is the only honest way to understand what these missions were actually worth. What the program did leave behind, beyond the trucks it destroyed and the trail it never quite closed, was something else. It was a body of knowledge about how a small number of men could operate deep behind enemy lines, deniably, effectively, at a survivable cost if the tactics were done right. That knowledge shaped how the American military built special operations forces for the rest of the century. Men who survived, this program went on to help build the units that came after it, carrying forward everything this brutal, secret education had taught them. In that sense, the cost paid by Doyle's generation purchased something that outlasted the war that demanded it, even though it could not win that war outright. There is one more debt in this story that deserves to be named plainly, because it is too often left out. The Montagnard and Nung fighters who made up the majority of most of these teams paid the same price as the Americans, mission for mission, and in many cases paid it for longer. When the war ended and the Americans went home, many of these indigenous allies could not follow. They stayed behind in a country whose new government remembered exactly who they had fought for and exactly what unit they had served in. Some were imprisoned. Some suffered far worse. The debt this story owes to them is at least as large as the one it owes to the Americans who led them across that border, and it is a debt that was, in most cases, never repaid. Doyle survived the war. Many of the men he served beside did not. He lived to see the day, decades later, when the government that had sent him quietly began to admit what it had asked of him. It took a very long time. For years after he came home, he could not speak about most of what he had done. It was not only a matter of habit or reticence. The missions were classified and remained so for a long time after the war ended. That meant a man who had done some of the most dangerous work of the entire conflict could not tell his own story, even to the people closest to him, because the truth belonged to a government that had not yet decided the public was allowed to know it. He lived for years beside people who knew only that he had served in Vietnam. He had no way to explain the specific weight he carried, because explaining it was against the law. He thought often about the families of the men who had not come back. Some were still listed as missing decades on, their true story sitting in a file somewhere, waiting for a clearance that might never fully come in their lifetimes. He had known some of those men. He had watched some of them go out on missions and not return. For years, he carried the knowledge of roughly what had happened to them, while their families back home knew only the vague, incomplete story the classification allowed. That was its own kind of burden, a grief he was not permitted to share honestly with the people who most needed to hear it. It stayed with him longer than almost anything else from the war. When the records finally opened, years later, the world began to learn what men like him had actually done. The missions, the casualty rates, the fight along that trail that had officially never involved American soldiers at all. Doyle felt something complicated. Relief, certainly, that the truth could finally be told, and that the families of the missing might finally get real answers instead of classified silence. But also a kind of grief. It had taken so long, and some of the men who had died had carried that same silence to their graves, never knowing that history would eventually vindicate the truth they were forbidden to tell. He came in his old age to a settled understanding of what he and his teammates had actually been. Not simply soldiers, something closer to a debt the country had taken out against its own honesty. They were men who had agreed to disappear a little into the classified space between what a nation does and what it admits to doing, so that the trail could be watched and the war could be fought in the shadows it needed to be fought in. He did not regret volunteering. He was proud in the end of the work and of the men beside him, but he never stopped thinking about the years his own family had spent not fully understanding where he had been. And he never stopped thinking about the families of the missing who had waited so much longer for so much less. In his final years, Doyle attended a reunion of the men who had survived and a memorial ceremony for the ones who had not, and he found himself standing in front of a wall of names that had, for most of his life, been a wall of silence. Now the names were simply there, carved and public, the missions beside them finally described in plain, unclassified language. He touched a few of them. He had known these men. He had waited by radios for some of them on nights when the news never came. Standing there, an old man, he felt the strange relief of a debt finally being paid, decades late, to people who could no longer collect it themselves, and he understood, more clearly than ever, that telling their story now, honestly, was the only repayment left to make. Here is what it actually meant to be the kind of soldier this story's about, and why the danger was never the whole of it. Every soldier in that war accepted the risk of death. That risk was terrible, and it was shared by everyone who served on every side in every unit. But the men who crossed that border accepted something further, something that very few soldiers in American history have ever been asked to carry. They accepted that if the worst happened, their own country might not be able to say where they had died. It might not even admit they had been sent there at all. The very secrecy that let them do the mission might, in the end, deny their family the simple truth of what had happened to their son. That is a unique and lonely kind of courage. It is one thing to risk your life for your country. It is another thing entirely to risk disappearing from your country's own official memory on your country's own orders as the price of the mission it asked you to run. And they did it anyway, again and again, at a cost that approached total. This was a community of volunteers so consistently wounded or killed that survival without being hit at all was the rare exception. They did it because the trail had to be watched. They did it because the war on the ground depended on what these small teams could learn and disrupt in the shadows. And they did it because the men beside them were going, and you do not let your team cross that border without you. The truth about what they did stayed classified for years after the guns fell silent. That meant some of these men died twice, once in the jungle and again in the silence that followed, when their own families could not be told the real story of where and how. It took the passage of decades and the slow work of declassification for the world to finally learn what a few hundred volunteers had achieved and paid for along a trail that, officially, no American soldier had ever set foot on. Think one more time about the shape of the bargain these men made, because it is unlike almost any other in the history of American arms. A soldier in a conventional unit traded his safety for his country's cause, and if he fell, his country promised to remember him honestly. These men traded their safety for the same cause, and their country reserved the right, if they fell, to say nothing at all. They knew this when they raised their hands to volunteer. They knew it on every mission afterward. And they went anyway, not because they did not understand what they were risking, but because they understood it completely and decided the trail still needed watching. Sergeant First Class Ray Doyle stood in a briefing tent and was told he was not going where he was about to go. Then he went anyway into a country his government would deny, wearing gear built to make sure that denial could never be disproven, leading men who might vanish with no accounting at all. He came home. Many did not, and for years, none of them could tell anyone the whole truth of what it had cost. That is what it meant to fight a war that officially did not happen. Now you know why the men who fought it deserve to be remembered by name. At last, out loud. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the classified ones fought in silence by men whose own country could not admit they were there. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, in a recon team, in special forces, in any classified or conventional unit, anyone at all, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them still cannot tell all of it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.